Vengeful Spirit Strikes Back, Justice from Beyond. Late at night, a young student named Khang arrives at his university's hall for an acting rehearsal with a group of friends. The eerie atmosphere deepens as he hears a sorrowful voice singing an old melody from within the hall. He soon realizes that the voice isn't from anyone in his group. As he investigates, the mystery unfolds, hinting at a vengeful spirit lurking among them. Khang and his friends, especially a wealthy but manipulative girl named Vivian, delve into the intense world of the traditional Vietnamese theater club at their university. Vivian, with a dark history and malicious intentions, decides to sabotage Khang. Driven by jealousy and humiliation after he rejects her public confession, she seeks supernatural help to summon a deadly curse. However, her plan backfires disastrously, leading to a horrific sequence of events in which Khang is haunted by a protective spirit of a deceased girl, while his friends, especially Vivian, face terrifying consequences. In a series of ghostly apparitions, horrific accidents, and deadly curses, Khang must survive the wrath of an unknown force determined to expose the secrets of the past. His connection with the protective spirit reveals a past tragedy that cannot be silenced. The terrifying tale culminates with tragic justice as Vivian faces her ultimate reckoning, leaving Khang to confront the chilling truth behind the ghostly occurrences. Part 1. A stormy night and a strange voice. The night was dense with a suffocating darkness, clouds swallowing the stars above as rain lashed against the windows of the university. Khang had just finished his last class, his books tucked under one arm as he hurried through the hallways, hoping to reach the auditorium before the storm grew worse. A shy, thoughtful student, Khang often felt out of place in the bustling university, finding his only solace in the quiet, traditional arts that called to his soul. The dimly lit corridor stretched before him, empty save for the occasional flicker of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Khang tightened his grip on his books, a strange heaviness growing in the pit of his stomach as he approached the auditorium. Tonight's rehearsal was especially important in the traditional theater club. A close-knit group of students passionate about Vietnamese arts had been preparing for weeks for the upcoming performance. But something was different. The familiar buzz of his friends laughing, chatting, and running lines was missing. In fact, the whole building seemed shrouded in an unnatural silence, as if the rain had drowned out any trace of life within these walls. He paused outside the grand doors of the auditorium, pressing a palm to the cool wood, feeling the gentle thrum of raindrops tapping against the windows somewhere far off in the distance. The usual warmth of the auditorium, its heavy red curtains, worn-out seats, and dusty stage lights was inviting. But tonight, an invisible barrier seemed to hold him back. He glanced down the empty hallway, wondering if he was truly alone. A bolt of lightning flashed outside, casting ghostly shadows along the walls, and Khang couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkened corners. Pushing the doors open, he was met with a vast emptiness that swallowed his figure. The rows of chairs seemed to stretch on endlessly in the dim light, fading into the dark abyss beyond the stage. Khang took a few tentative steps forward, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him with a loud creak that echoed throughout the hall. A shiver ran through him as he made his way toward the stage, the soles of his shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. He clutched his books tightly, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt in the empty hall. Then, just as he reached the edge of the stage, he heard it. A voice, soft, mournful, dripping with despair, floated through the air, barely a whisper yet chillingly clear. Khang froze, his heart hammering in his chest as the melody twisted and turned, filling the silent hall with an otherworldly sorrow. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The voice was beautiful in its sadness, like a lone bird crying out in the darkness, its notes curling around him like wisps of fog. Run, the whisper drifted through the air, barely audible yet as clear as if someone had whispered directly into his ear. Khang's blood turned to ice. His first instinct was to look around, searching for the source of the voice. But the hall was empty, desolate, save for the flickering shadows cast by the storm outside. His pulse quickened, his breathing shallow as the urge to flee clawed at his senses, an instinctive reaction to the raw fear gripping him. Run, the whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent, sending a chill down his spine. It was as if someone or something was hiding just out of sight, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Khang swallowed, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. His legs felt rooted to the floor, paralyzed by the strange sensation that had wrapped around him like a shroud. The voice was like a song from a distant, tragic past, echoing through the empty hall with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He strained to see into the darkness, his eyes scanning the rows of empty chairs, the silent stage, the darkened wings where the curtains hung like waiting shadows. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling as it echoed back to him, swallowed by the oppressive silence. His question hung in the air, unanswered, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, sharper, as though the voice was right there, hovering just beyond the veil of darkness. In the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement, a flash of something pale and shimmering, barely visible against the shadows. His heart skipped a beat as he turned his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the empty seat stretching out into the darkness. Yet the feeling persisted, a gnawing, insistent presence that made his stomach twist with fear. He took a shaky step back, his instinct screaming at him to leave, to run as the voice had warned, but his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot by an invisible force that kept him trapped in place. The whisper echoed again, softer this time, almost a plea. Run, summoning every ounce of courage he had left. Khang turned, his breath catching in his throat as he staggered toward the doors. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step filled with the growing sense of dread that prickled along his skin. Just as he reached the door, he glanced back one last time, feeling the inexplicable urge to confirm that he was alone. But what he saw made his blood run cold. In the dim light of the hall, a figure stood silently in the middle of the stage, a girl, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, her pale face obscured by the shadows. Her dress fluttered gently, as if moved by a non-existent breeze, and her eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to pierce through him with a gaze filled with unimaginable sorrow. Khang's heart raced as he gripped the door handle, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. The girl didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her presence filled the hall, her figure etched into the darkness like a ghostly reminder of some long-forgotten tragedy. He wanted to call out, to ask who she was, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the fear that had wrapped around his chest like a vice. And then, with a final, chilling whisper, the voice came once more, her gaze locking onto his as she uttered the single word that would haunt him for nights to come. Run. Without thinking, Khang wrenched the door open, stumbling out into the hallway as his breath came in ragged gasps. He didn't stop, didn't look back as he bolted down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the empty building as he fled from the haunting presence that had filled the auditorium. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing through the windows, casting brief, flickering shadows along the walls as he ran. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, the echo of the voice following him down the hallway, a ghostly reminder of the girl he had seen, the sorrowful gaze that seemed to pierce through his soul. Khang's mind raced with questions, each one tinged with a fear he couldn't shake. Who was she? Why was she there, alone in the darkness, her voice filled with such unbearable sadness? And why, of all things, had she told him to run? He reached the exit, bursting out into the rain-soaked night as the storm washed over him, the cold drops stinging his skin and grounding him back to reality. But even as he stood there, shivering in the rain, the memory of the girl's voice lingered in his mind, an echo that refused to fade. Run, the word replayed in his thoughts, a haunting refrain that filled him with an inexplicable dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something unspeakable, that the presence in the auditorium had been more than just a figment of his imagination. There was something deeply wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of the university's ordinary walls, a dark secret that whispered to him in the shadows. As he walked home through the rain, his footsteps heavy and his mind filled with the chilling memory of that sorrowful voice, Khang couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The girl's mournful whisper clung to him like a shadow, a warning of something lurking just beyond the edge of reality. In the days that followed, Khang would return to the auditorium, drawn back by the strange, irresistible pull of the voice that had called to him that night. But deep down, he knew that whatever had happened in the darkness of the hall was far from over. The ghostly warning echoed in his heart, a silent promise of the terror that awaited him, and Khang found himself haunted by a single, chilling thought: he wasn't alone. Part 2, Vivian's Humiliation and Vengeful Plan. The stormy night lingered in Khang's mind like a dark fog, but for Vivian, that same night marked the beginning of a grudge she would not let go. Vivian was not just another member of the traditional theatre club, she was its unofficial queen. She had the money, the beauty, and an allure that left people in awe. Her family was wealthy, owning numerous businesses, and she carried herself with the pride and entitlement of someone who had always gotten what she wanted. Except it seemed this time, days after the night when Khang encountered the strange presence in the auditorium, Vivian had orchestrated a grand gesture. She had planned it perfectly, waiting until everyone from the club gathered in the university courtyard after rehearsals. She knew her allure was powerful, and she was sure Khang would feel the thrill of her attention. So in front of a small crowd of club members, she boldly confessed her feelings, her voice loud and confident, a rehearsed mixture of vulnerability and charm. But what Vivian hadn't anticipated was Khang's reaction. His expression was one of genuine shock and discomfort. Instead of basking in the attention and playing along, Khang had quietly but firmly turned her down, his face flushing in embarrassment as he apologized, hoping to spare her feelings. Vivian's face had twisted, first in shock, then in barely restrained fury, as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. She felt their eyes on her, not with admiration, but with curiosity, even pity. The rejection cut her pride like a knife. She had never been refused, never been humiliated like this, especially in public. Vivian seethed, her carefully crafted mask of perfection cracking as whispers filled the courtyard. Her friends gave her sympathetic looks, and some even tried to follow her as she stormed away. But she shrugged them off, anger boiling over. She had thought Khang would be flattered by her interest, honored even. But his rejection felt like an insult, a slap to her pride that she would never forget. And as she sat alone in her car later that night, fuming, a dark thought crept into her mind, a plan that would give her the revenge she craved. Days passed, and Vivian's anger festered, growing into something more sinister. She spent hours stewing over Khang's humiliation of her, replaying it in her mind until it consumed her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus in class, her thoughts fixated on that single, devastating moment. She felt as if Khang had stolen something from her, her dignity, her power, and she was determined to take it back. But she wanted him to suffer more than she had. The idea twisted in her mind, darkening, evolving, until one day she decided to take action. Vivian had heard rumors, whispers among her wealthier friends about a man who specialized in spiritual rituals, a practitioner who, for a price, would perform special favors for those willing to pay. Vivian had scoffed at the rumors before, dismissing them as superstitions for the gullible, but now, with her anger festering, the idea felt oddly comforting. If she could use a curse to ruin Khang's life, to make him regret the day he ever dared to humiliate her, she would consider it. With newfound determination, she drove through the city's narrow, winding streets, following directions from a friend. As the city's polished facade faded to rundown buildings and forgotten alleys, her nerves prickled, but she pushed her doubts aside. She wanted Khang to pay, no matter the cost. Finally, she arrived at an old, decrepit building tucked between abandoned shops, a place far removed from the luxury she was accustomed to. She approached the door, its faded paint peeling, and knocked. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a sunken face and piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through her. The dim room smelled of incense and old wood, and strange trinkets and symbols adorned every surface. Vivian felt a shiver run down her spine, but she reminded herself of her purpose. "You want something?" he asked, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken in days. Vivian took a deep breath, summoning her usual arrogance, though it faltered under his gaze. I need to place a curse on someone," she said, the words tumbling out with a mixture of anger and excitement. "I want him to suffer. I want him to regret what he's done." The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the bundle of cash she had brought with her. She held it out, her hand trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering. He took the money, his bony fingers brushing against hers, cold and unsettling. "This person, they hurt you?" he asked, a strange glint in his eyes as he studied her face, as if searching for something deeper. Vivian hesitated, her anger briefly wavering as the memories of that humiliating moment flooded her mind. "Yes," she whispered, her voice laced with bitterness. He made a fool of me, and I want him to suffer for it." The man nodded, as though he understood, though there was a darkness in his gaze that made Vivian's skin crawl. He gestured for her to sit, and as she lowered herself onto the worn cushion he provided, he reached for a small, tattered book on the table. The pages were yellowed, filled with strange symbols and faded writing that Vivian couldn't understand. She watched as he muttered something under his breath, his fingers tracing patterns over the pages. Finally he looked up, his face expressionless. "There is a cost," he said slowly. "To hurt someone with a curse, you must be willing to accept that pain may return to you. Are you sure this is what you want?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "Yes, I don't care what it costs, just make him suffer." The man's lips twisted into a grim smile as he began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, filling the room with an eerie hum that seemed to seep into her skin. Vivian felt a strange cold sensation spreading through her chest, a weight pressing down on her heart. The air thickened, the dim room seeming to grow darker as he continued his ritual, a faint, sickly sweet smell filling the space. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped, his eyes meeting hers. "It is done," he said simply, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The curse will bind to him, his spirit marked by your pain. But remember, once it begins, it cannot be undone." Vivian nodded, feeling a thrill of satisfaction as she rose, the man's warning barely registering in her mind. She thanked him curtly, her voice cold as she turned to leave, the sense of triumph warming her anger. Khang would pay, she was sure of it. The curse was her secret weapon, a tool that would bring him misery, a justice for the humiliation he had caused her. As she walked out into the night, the chill of the man's words lingered in the back of her mind. Yet she pushed it aside, eager for the moment when Khang would feel the first pangs of the curse. She wanted to see his calm demeanor crumble, to watch as he unraveled piece by piece. Her heart raced with anticipation, her anger soothed by the thought of his suffering. Days passed and Vivian watched Khang closely, waiting for signs that the curse had taken hold. At first there was nothing. He continued his days, quietly attending classes, joining rehearsals with the same quiet dedication as before. But then strange things began to happen. Khang would sometimes freeze during rehearsals, his face paling as if he were seeing something no one else could. His eyes would dart around the room, filled with a fear that seemed to creep into his every movement. Whispers spread among the club members, stories of how Khang had become distracted, distant, as if haunted by something unseen. Vivian watched it all with a growing sense of satisfaction, her lips curling into a smile as she observed his unease. She could feel the curse working, its dark tendrils weaving into his life, disrupting his calm demeanor. And yet, as she watched him from afar, a strange sensation began to creep over her, a faint unease that tugged at the edges of her mind, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had unleashed something far beyond her control. But she brushed the feeling aside, her desire for revenge blinding her to the warnings. She had set something dark in motion, and Khang would face the consequences. Part 3. Haunting Warning. The night had settled heavily around Khang's small, dimly lit room. He lay in bed, the soft glow from his bedside lamp casting faint shadows along the walls. Yet, despite the warmth of his familiar surroundings, a strange tension filled the air, creeping into his bones and refusing to let go. Since Vivian's very public confession and the strange unease that had been plaguing him ever since, Khang had been finding it difficult to sleep. He closed his eyes, hoping for rest, but the darkness behind his eyelids only seemed to deepen, swallowing him whole. Gradually, sleep took him and Khang fell into a strange, uneasy dream. He was back in the university auditorium, the vast, empty space stretching endlessly before him. The silence was thick, oppressive, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He took a tentative step forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, each sound reverberating through the emptiness. The air was cold, prickling against his skin, and a faint shiver crept up his spine. He glanced around, the dim, shadowed seats stretching out like rows of silent spectators. The stage loomed ahead, bathed in a soft, eerie green glow that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. It was the same stage where he had rehearsed countless times, but tonight it felt different, haunted, as though something terrible had happened here, something unspeakable. As Khang stepped closer to the stage, a chilling sensation washed over him. There was a figure standing in the middle of the stage, barely visible against the eerie light. His heart pounded as he strained to make out her features, his mind struggling to process the figure's strange, ghostly appearance. The girl was dressed in green, her long, dark hair falling around her face like a curtain. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes dark, hollow, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into the air around her. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but he felt her gaze, felt it pierce through him, as though she were seeing straight into his soul. Khang, her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the empty hall, filling every corner, every shadow. The sound wrapped around him like a shroud, cold and haunting, sending a tremor through his body. He took a step back, his breath catching as the figure's gaze sharpened, her expression contorting with urgency. "Run, Khang, run before it's too late," the words slipped from her lips, each one heavy with a sorrow that twisted in his chest. Before he could react, the green light intensified, bathing the hall in an unnatural glow that seemed to suffocate him, pressing down on his lungs and stealing his breath. His vision blurred, the edges of the world darkening as the girl's face filled his sight, her pale features growing more distorted, more desperate. "Khang, you have to go, you have to run." But her voice was growing fainter, fading into the depths of his mind as his surroundings blurred and twisted, the auditorium melting away into shadows. Panic clawed at him, an instinctual fear urging him to flee, to escape, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The weight of her sorrow pressed down on him, filling his lungs, his heart, his very soul, until he felt he would drown in it. Suddenly, the darkness around him shattered, and he found himself standing in a strange, cold room. The walls were bare, the air stale, and he felt the overwhelming sensation that he was being watched. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach as he came face to face with the girl once more. But this time her face was twisted, blood dripping from her lips, her hollow eyes wide with terror. She raised a hand reaching toward him, and he saw her fingers, thin and bony, streaked with red. Her voice was no longer a whisper, but a desperate, agonized scream. "Khang!" Run! A blinding pain shot through his chest, jolting him awake. Khang bolted upright in his bed, his chest heaving, his heart racing as though it would burst from his ribcage. He was drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his skin, and his breaths came in ragged gasps, his body trembling uncontrollably. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of his bedside lamp, but the image of the girl's twisted, blood-streaked face was seared into his mind. As he tried to calm his breathing, he felt a strange, cold sensation against his chest. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his hand, brushing his fingers over his skin, and froze. There, pressed against his skin, was a mark, faint but undeniable. It was a handprint, small and delicate, as though someone had pressed their fingers to his chest and left a chilling reminder of their presence. The skin beneath the mark tingled with an unnatural cold, and a shiver ran through him as he stared at the ghostly imprint. He could feel it, the faint impression of fingers, as though someone had been holding his heart in their grasp, squeezing it until he was on the edge of death. The weight of the handprint was suffocating, filling him with an indescribable fear that twisted in his gut, gnawing at his mind. A whisper echoed in his ears, faint and haunting, a memory of the girl's desperate voice urging him to flee. "Khang, run!" Before it was too late, his hand trembled as he traced the outline of the mark, a creeping horror filling him as he realized the depth of the warning. This was no mere dream, no figment of his imagination. The handprint was real, its chill seeping into his skin, a cold reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond his understanding. But what did it mean? Who was the girl? And why was she so desperate to warn him? The questions tumbled through his mind, each one heavier than the last, filling him with a dread that he couldn't shake. As the night wore on, Khang sat in the darkness, staring at the ghostly handprint on his chest, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The room around him felt suffocating, the air thick with an unseen presence that made his skin crawl. He glanced around, half expecting to see her shadow lurking in the corners, watching him, waiting. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory of the girl's twisted, sorrowful face filled his vision, her desperate plea echoing in his ears. The handprint on his chest burned like ice, a constant reminder of her warning, of the danger that awaited him if he ignored it. By the time the first light of dawn filtered to his window, Khang was exhausted, his mind frayed by the endless cycle of fear and uncertainty. He glanced down at his chest, half hoping that the handprint would have faded with the morning light. But it was still there, a pale, haunting imprint that refused to disappear, clinging to his skin like a ghostly brand. Khang knew that he couldn't ignore the warning. Something dark was lurking in the shadows, something that wanted him to suffer, to break. And the girl, the mysterious, sorrowful girl in green, was the only link he had to understanding the nightmare that had begun to unravel his life. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he resolved to return to the auditorium, to the place where he had first seen her, hoping that he might find answers, or perhaps some way to escape the darkness that seemed to be closing in around him. But even as he made his decision, a lingering dread settled over him, a quiet, insistent voice in the back of his mind reminding him of the girl's final, desperate warning. Run the word echoed in his thoughts, filling him with a creeping sense of doom. He could feel it, the darkness drawing nearer, its cold fingers brushing against his soul, promising that this was only the beginning. Part 4. The first death bow's fatal fall. The days following Khang's haunting encounter left an atmosphere of dread lingering over him. A silent storm had started to brew, unnoticed by most, but for Khang, the shadows seemed darker, heavier, and the very air around him felt thick, like something was always watching, always waiting. Meanwhile, Vivian, still reveling in the supposed curse she had placed on Khang, went about her days with a twisted satisfaction, watching him from afar. Yet as time passed, an unnerving sensation crept into her mind, a sense that the curse was evolving, taking on a life of its own. But her pride dismissed the notion. She didn't truly believe in the powers of the curse, she merely hoped for Khang to suffer a little. Still, the feeling gnawed at her, slipping through the cracks of her smug smile. Her closest friend Bao noticed her shifting mood. Bao, like Vivian, came from wealth and influence, a golden boy who was known for his charm and arrogance. The two had been inseparable for years, partners in mischief, and a constant source of scandalous gossip. Vivian confided everything to him, and as she poured out her frustrations about Khang, he listened with a grin, feeding off her bitterness, amused by her obsession. One evening, as their rehearsals were wrapping up, Bao leaned against the window on the 9th floor, overlooking the courtyard below. He enjoyed the thrill of being so high up, the view of the campus sprawling beneath him, small and insignificant from such heights. Vivian joined him, her arms crossed, her expression dark. "You still can't let it go, can you?" Bao teased, his voice dripping with amusement as he watched her frown. Vivian scoffed, glancing down at the courtyard, her fingers tapping against her arm. "It's not that, Bao. I just want him to understand. He embarrassed me." Bao laughed, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. "You're too much, Vivi. You've already done more than enough to him, don't you think?" Vivian's gaze hardened. No, not nearly enough, but as the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Bao felt a strange, growing sense of unease. He tried to shake it off, yet the longer he stood there, the more the view below seemed to distort, as though a shadow were creeping up from the ground, inching toward him. Dismissing the feeling, Bao finally said good night to Vivian, leaving her to her musings as he walked down the deserted hallway alone. He felt the air around him grow colder, an eerie silence settling over the building, so thick that it muffled even the sound of his footsteps. Every instinct urged him to leave quickly, but his pride kept him steady, and he took his time, passing each empty classroom with a casual arrogance. Reaching the end of the hall, he paused, glancing over his shoulder, the sensation of being watched prickling his skin. The hallway behind him was empty, but there was something unsettling about the shadows stretching along the floor, as though they were slowly creeping toward him. Suddenly he heard a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. A low, mournful hum that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. Bao stopped, his heart pounding as he scanned the hallway, but there was nothing there, just darkness. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice sounding small and hollow against the silence. No answer, but the whisper continued, soft and persistent, like the distant wail of a child crying in the night. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around him in an icy grip. His mouth went dry, his pulse hammering as he quickened his pace, eager to leave the eerie quiet of the building. As he approached the staircase, his phone vibrated, the screen lighting up with a text from Vivian come back up. "I forgot something." Annoyed, Bao turned on his heel, heading back toward the 9th floor, unaware that the faint shadow creeping along the floor was now following his steps, slithering along the walls, growing darker with each passing second. Back on the 9th floor, he called out to Vivian, but the only response was silence. Confused, he walked toward the window where they had stood earlier, the shadows seeming to close in around him, pressing against his skin with a chilling intensity. The whisper returned, louder this time, the voice twisting into something almost human, yet distorted, warped. The sound seemed to seep into his mind, filling him with a sensation of dread he couldn't shake. His hands trembled as he looked around, every instinct screaming at him to leave, but his pride held him there, refusing to acknowledge the fear curling in his stomach. Then, from the shadows, he saw her. The figure of a girl, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, obscuring her face. She wore a green dress, the fabric tattered and torn, and her figure was faint, almost transparent, as though she were only half real. But her eyes dark, hollow, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to claw at his heart. The girl lifted a pale hand, pointing directly at him, her eyes locked onto his with a chilling intensity. She whispered, her voice low and haunting, filled with a sadness that twisted inside him like a knife. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran through him, his heart racing as he took a step back, but his feet felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The girl's gaze held him in place, her sorrow bleeding into the air around them, filling his lungs with a suffocating weight. "Run," she whispered, her voice a faint echo that seemed to come from within his own mind. The shadows around him grew darker, colder, pressing in closer with each second. He tried to turn, to flee, but his body wouldn't obey, trapped in the grip of an invisible force. Then, in a single, terrifying instant, he felt his feet slip, his balance tipping as the world tilted around him. He stumbled, reaching out for the edge of the window, but his hands passed through the air, finding no grip, no solid surface. His stomach lurched as he fell, the ground rushing up to meet him, and he saw the girl's face above him, her hollow eyes watching him with a sorrowful, resigned expression. The last thing he saw was her pale hand reaching out, as though to catch him, before the world went dark. The next morning, the university was buzzing with whispers and rumors. Bao's body had been found in the courtyard, his lifeless eyes staring up at the 9th floor, wide and filled with a terror that would haunt anyone who looked into them. The faculty tried to contain the news, but the story spread quickly, a wave of shock and fear rippling through the campus. Vivian, devastated, stared blankly as the paramedics covered Bao's body, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't explain. She had known Bao for years, trusted him, confided in him, and now he was gone, his death as mysterious as it was tragic. But as she looked up at the 9th floor window, a chill ran down her spine, and for the first time she felt a gnawing dread, a sense that her actions had set something dark and uncontrollable into motion. In the days that followed, Vivian couldn't shake the memory of the curse. She had dismissed it as superstition, a silly, impulsive act to satisfy her wounded pride. But now, with Bao's death haunting her, she began to wonder if the curse was more real than she had ever believed. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, a whisper lingered, filling her with a fear she couldn't escape. The curse had only just begun. Part 5. Vivian's gruesome end on stage. The day of the performance arrived with a tense energy that seemed to grip everyone in the traditional theatre club. Despite the excitement in the air, a strange undercurrent of dread crept through the auditorium, lurking in the shadows and clinging to every corner. Khang, still haunted by the strange experiences that had been unfolding over the past few weeks, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It was as if an invisible weight pressed down on him, an omen that he couldn't quite decipher. Vivian, however, was determined to perform, brushing aside her lingering unease with the same confidence she wore like a second skin. She had spent hours perfecting every detail of her role, the costume shimmering in hues of emerald green, the intricate embroidery catching the light in flashes of gold and silver. Despite Bao's recent and tragic death, she refused to allow the specter of misfortune to distract her. She was the star, the center of attention, and tonight she would be glorious. As the audience filled the seats, the lights dimmed, and the soft hum of anticipation settled over the crowd, Vivian stood in the wings, adjusting her dress and casting an approving glance at herself in the mirror. Her face was painted with perfect elegance, her features sharp and mesmerizing beneath the heavy stage makeup. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she heard the first notes of the music drift into the auditorium, each beat pulling her closer to her moment in the spotlight. But something else seemed to stir in the dark, something that lay just beyond her perception, watching her with unseen eyes. The shadows along the walls seemed darker, deeper, as though they were gathering strength, waiting. Yet Vivian, blinded by her ambition, felt only the thrill of performance, the intoxicating rush of knowing that every eye would soon be fixed upon her. The stage lights flickered once, then twice, before finally stabilizing, casting an ethereal glow over the set. Vivian's cue came, and with a final look at her reflection, she stepped onto the stage, her every movement precise and graceful, each step exuding a practiced confidence. The audience watched, entranced, as she began to dance, her movements fluid and captivating, her emerald dress swirling around her like a river of jade. She spun and twirled, her gaze fixed on the audience, her lips curving into a self-assured smile as the music swelled. For a moment, the performance was flawless, mesmerizing, as Vivian commanded the stage with all the ease of someone born to perform. But then, as she reached the center of the stage, a strange sensation washed over her. The air grew cold, chilling her skin beneath the heavy fabric of her costume. She hesitated, her steps faltering for the briefest moment, her heartbeat quickening as a sudden wave of dread swept through her. The shadows at the edge of the stage seemed to thicken, pressing in closer, wrapping around her like a cloak of darkness. A faint whisper echoed in her mind, barely audible over the music, yet unmistakable. It was a voice, soft and sorrowful, filled with an agony that clawed at her heart. Vivian, the voice murmured, a chilling tremor beneath its tone. Why didn't you listen? Vivian's breath hitched, her confidence faltering as the words seeped into her mind, filling her with an indescribable fear. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the wings, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there, only darkness. The audience, oblivious to her unease, continued to watch, their expressions enraptured as she resumed her dance. But something was wrong. Vivian could feel it, a heavy, suffocating presence that clung to her like a shadow. She forced herself to continue, her every movement now mechanical, her steps wooden as her mind raced with fear. And then, in a single terrible instant, she felt it. Above her, a faint creak echoed through the auditorium, barely discernible over the music, but enough to make her heart stop. She looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the massive spotlight, hanging precariously from the rafters, its heavy metal frame gleaming ominously in the dim light. It swayed once, then twice, as if guided by some invisible hand, before it began to descend. The moment stretched into eternity as Vivian watched, frozen in place, her body paralyzed by the horror of what she saw. She tried to scream, to move, but her voice died in her throat, her feet rooted to the stage as the light plummeted toward her. And then, with a deafening crash, the spotlight struck. The impact was immediate and brutal, the heavy metal slamming into her with a sickening force that echoed through the hall, a sound that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. Vivian's body crumpled beneath the weight, her emerald dress stained with blood as the spotlight pinned her to the stage, its harsh light illuminating her broken figure. A gasp rippled through the audience, a collective intake of breath as horror settled over the room. Faces turned pale, hands clutched at mouths, and eyes filled with shock and disbelief as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The music stopped, the silence pressing down on them like a suffocating weight, and all eyes were fixed on the stage, where Vivian lay motionless beneath the shattered spotlight. Khang, watching from the wings, felt a cold wave of nausea wash over him. He staggered back, his mind reeling as he stared at her lifeless form, the realization of what he was witnessing crashing over him with a sickening clarity. Vivian, the queen of the club, the girl who had always been in control, lay broken and still, her life snuffed out in an instant. But even as he stared, he felt an overwhelming sensation, a feeling that something dark and unseen lingered on that stage, watching with a twisted satisfaction. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, a silence that spoke of death and vengeance, and Khang felt it settle deep in his chest, a weight that seemed to crush him from within. For the briefest moment he saw her, the girl in green, her sorrowful gaze fixed upon Vivian's body, her expression one of quiet resignation. She stood at the edge of the stage, her figure faint and flickering, a ghostly presence that seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Khang's heart pounded as he took a step forward, his mind screaming at him to look away, to flee, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the scene before him. The girl's gaze met his, and for an instant he felt her sorrow wash over him, a wave of despair so profound it left him gasping for breath. Just as the girl's voice whispered, her words filling his mind with an echo of unimaginable pain, justice for what was lost, justice for what was taken. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone, leaving only the memory of her voice lingering in his mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had claimed Vivian. As the paramedics arrived, rushing to the stage with pale, horrified expressions, the audience began to file out, their faces etched with shock and fear. Whispers filled the air, murmurs of disbelief and horror, as people tried to make sense of the tragedy they had just witnessed. But Khang knew deep in his heart that this was no mere accident, Bao's death. Vivian's gruesome end, these were not random occurrences, not mere coincidences. Something dark, something vengeful had been unleashed, and it was not finished. He could feel it, a looming shadow that stretched beyond the bounds of life and death, a force that demanded retribution. As he left the auditorium that night, his steps slow and his mind filled with dread, Khang couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The curse, whatever it was, had only just begun to reveal its wrath, and he was helpless to stop it. Vivian's death was a message, a warning of what lay ahead. And as he walked into the cold, silent night, he could hear her voice echoing in his mind, a whisper that chilled him to the bone. Run, but he knew that running would be useless. The curse had woven itself into their lives, binding them to its fate. And with each passing moment, the shadows grew darker, the air colder, as the invisible force tightened its grip, waiting for its next victim. Khang glanced back at the darkened auditorium, a shiver running down his spine as he saw a faint, flickering light in the window, a reminder of the spirit that lingered there, watching, waiting. The curse was far from over, and as he walked away, he knew with a certainty that his life and the lives of everyone in that club would never be the same. Part 6. Khang's Revelation of the Spirit. The night air hung thick and heavy, shrouding the university in an unnatural silence. Khang walked through the deserted campus, his heart pounding with the weight of the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. He had tried to ignore the strange occurrences, to dismiss the eerie whispers and shadowy visions that haunted his every step, but Vivian's brutal death on stage had shattered any hope of denial. Something dark and malevolent had taken root within their world, and Khang could feel its grip tightening with every passing day. As he retraced his steps back to the auditorium, the memories flooded his mind. With a dizzying intensity, the sorrowful voice that had urged him to flee, the ghostly handprint that had appeared on his chest, Bao's horrific fall from the 9th floor, and then finally, Vivian's gruesome end beneath the spotlight. Each incident carried a sinister weight, an invisible thread that linked them all together, drawing Khang into a nightmare he could no longer escape. He found himself standing at the entrance to the auditorium, the doors looming before him like the maw of some monstrous creature, waiting to swallow him whole. The memories of that place were filled with darkness and shadows, and yet he felt an inexplicable urge to enter, a pull he couldn't resist. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and pushed the door open, stepping into the dim, empty hall. The auditorium was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist along the walls. Khang's footsteps echoed in the silence, each step filled with the weight of his fear. As he approached the stage, the sight of Vivian's tragic death. The air was thick, stifling, as if it held the very essence of the sorrow and terror that had taken place there. As he stood at the edge of the stage, a strange sensation washed over him, a presence, familiar yet distant, as if someone were watching him from the darkness. His heart raced as he looked around, searching the empty seats, the shadowed wings, but there was no one there. Just the oppressive silence, pressing down on him like a heavy, invisible weight. And then he felt it, a chill creeping up his spine, a sensation that sent a tremor through his body. The shadows along the walls seemed to deepen, pooling around him, swirling like dark tendrils reaching out, drawing closer. The temperature dropped, the air filled with an icy, unnatural cold, and Khang's breath hitched as he felt the presence settle around him, lingering just beyond the edge of his vision. Khang. The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it filled the silence with an aching sorrow that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the same voice, the one that had haunted his dreams, the voice that had warned him to run. He turned slowly, his gaze drawn to the darkness at the back of the stage, where a figure stood, barely visible in the faint light. It was a girl, her figure delicate and ethereal, shrouded in a green dress that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes dark, hollow, filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to reach into his soul. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken words. Khang's heart pounded as he took in her sorrowful gaze, the weight of her grief pressing down on him, filling him with a sorrow he couldn't explain. Ngoc, he whispered, the name slipping from his lips like a memory half remembered. The girl's gaze softened, a faint, sad smile playing at the corners of her lips as she nodded, acknowledging the name, the identity that had been lost to the shadows. Her eyes held a depth of sorrow and regret, a pain that seemed to transcend life and death, lingering in the empty spaces, filling the air with an aching despair. Khang felt a wave of realization wash over him, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a horrifying clarity. Ngoc, the girl who had been whispering warnings in his ear, the ghostly figure that had haunted his every step, had once been a member of the theatre club. Just like him, her spirit had lingered, trapped between worlds, bound to the place where she had suffered, where her life had been cut short. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, thick with a mixture of fear and compassion. He could feel her pain as though it were his own, a wound that had festered in the silence, waiting for someone to listen, to understand. Ngoc's gaze flickered, her eyes darkening as memories seemed to surface, memories filled with pain and betrayal. "They hurt me, Khang," she whispered, her voice trembling with a grief so deep it sent a chill through his veins. "They took everything from me, my life, my dreams. They left me here, alone in the darkness." Khang's chest tightened as a word settled over him, a horrifying realization dawning in his mind. She wasn't just a spirit bound by sorrow, she was a soul trapped by injustice, a life cut short by those she had once trusted. The very people she had called friends, the same people who had betrayed him, who had watched as he suffered, had been the cause of her suffering, the architects of her tragic fate. "Val, Vivian," he murmured, the names falling from his lips, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on him. He felt a surge of anger, of grief, the pain of her loss merging with his own, a bond forged in shared suffering. Ngoc's expression twisted, her sorrow replaced by a quiet, simmering rage. "They took everything from me, Khang," she said, her voice low, filled with a bitterness that seemed to seep into the air around them. "They thought they could get away with it, that I would simply disappear, forgotten, left to fade in the darkness." Khang's mind raced as he tried to piece together the story, the fragments of her life and death forming a dark tapestry of betrayal and vengeance. He could see it now. Ngoc, once a bright, passionate member of the club, her dreams crushed, her spirit broken by the very people she had called friends. She had been silenced, her life stolen, and her soul had been left to linger, a shadow bound to the place of her suffering. "Why warn me?" he asked, his voice trembling as he looked into her hollow eyes, the question heavy with fear and gratitude. "Why protect me?" Ngoc's gaze softened, the anger fading as she looked at him, a faint glimmer of warmth in her sorrowful eyes. "Because you're different, Khang. You tried to understand, even when no one else would. I couldn't bear to see you suffer the same fate." Khang felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow filling his heart as he looked at her, this spirit bound by pain and vengeance, a soul that had lingered in the shadows waiting for someone to listen. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to offer her the peace she had been denied, but he knew that her pain ran too deep, a wound that could not be healed by simple kindness. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice a whisper filled with dread, the weight of her answer pressing down on him. Ngoc's expression hardened, her gaze shifting to the darkness around them, her figure growing fainter, more ethereal as the shadows seemed to consume her. "I have waited long enough, Khang. They must pay for what they've done." Khang felt a shiver run through him as her words filled the air, heavy with a chilling finality. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet, unyielding resolve of a soul that had been wronged, a spirit bound by vengeance, by a need for justice that had festered in the silence, growing darker with each passing year. As she began to fade, her figure dissolving into the shadows, Khang felt a surge of desperation, a fear that twisted in his chest. He wanted to stop her, to plead with her to let go, to find peace, but he knew that her path had already been set, a path carved by betrayal and suffering. "Ngoc, please," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his heart aching with a grief that was both his and hers. There has to be another way, but her gaze remained resolute, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow that seemed to reach into his soul. "Goodbye, Khang," she whispered, her voice a faint echo as her figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving only a lingering chill, a silence that seemed to echo with her unspoken words. Khang stood alone on the stage, his heart heavy with the weight of her sorrow, the knowledge that he could do nothing to stop the path she had chosen. She had been a victim, a life stolen, a soul wronged, and now she would claim the justice that had been denied to her. As he walked out of the auditorium, the cold night air filling his lungs, Khang couldn't shake the feeling that he was now bound to her fate, that he too was part of this dark tapestry, a thread woven into the fabric of her vengeance. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive, as he made his way across the campus, each step filled with the knowledge that he could not escape the darkness that had taken root in their lives. Ngoc's spirit had been awakened, her sorrow transformed into vengeance, and Khang knew with a chilling certainty that the curse she had unleashed was far from over. And as he walked into the night, the memory of her haunting whisper filled his mind, a reminder of the darkness that lingered, waiting to claim its next victim. Run. Part 7. The Auditorium's Dark Past. Khang had never felt such a visceral pull to the auditorium. The building, once a place of creativity and camaraderie, now seemed like a prison of shadows. The more he visited, the more he felt that every corner, every flickering light, every creak in the floorboards was alive, whispering fragments of secrets buried within its walls. And as much as he wanted to turn away, something in him insisted he stay, to uncover the truth that lay hidden in the darkness. After his revelation about Ngoc's spirit, Khang's days became consumed with piecing together her story. He couldn't shake the image of her sorrowful eyes, the bitterness in her voice when she spoke of betrayal. Questions clawed at his mind, refusing to let him rest. What had happened to her? Why did she die? And why had her spirit been bound to this place, restless and vengeful? His only answer lay in the heart of the theater itself. One evening, as dusk settled over the campus, Khang found himself standing at the entrance to the auditorium. A chill swept through the hallway, and he took a deep breath, steeling himself against the foreboding sense that he was stepping into a place where time had stopped, frozen in the moment of some unspeakable tragedy. The doors creaked as he entered, and the silence within was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The seats sat in rows of shadowed silence, waiting, and the stage loomed ahead, cloaked in the dim light that spilled from the emergency exit signs. Khang could feel the weight of the auditorium pressing down on him, as if it bore the memory of everything that had transpired within its walls. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast space. Each step felt like a descent, a slow journey into the depths of a past that the building had long kept hidden. But now, as he reached the edge of the stage, he felt something shift, like a veil lifting, and the air around him grew colder, filled with an unnatural chill that made his skin prickle. A faint whisper reached his ears, soft and sorrowful, filling the silence with a gnatch that cut through him like a knife. It was her voice, Ngoc's voice, and it was calling to him, a ghostly murmur that seemed to rise from the floor itself, as though the wooden metal of the stage bore her pain, her anger, her despair. As he placed a hand on the stage, a surge of images flooded his mind, vivid and haunting. He saw Ngoc, younger and full of life, her eyes alight with the passion and dedication that had once made her the heart of the theatre club. She had been a natural performer, a soul who lived and breathed the art, and the stage had been her sanctuary, a place where she could pour her heart out without fear or restraint. But then the images twisted, darkening, and Khang saw a different side of the club, a side filled with jealousy, spite, and betrayal. He saw the faces of those she had once trusted, twisted with envy and malice, whispering behind her back, conspiring against her. They had seen her as a threat, an obstacle to their ambitions, and their hatred had grown until it poisoned every corner of her world. One face stood out among the others' bow, his eyes cold and calculating, a cruel smirk on his lips as he watched her with a gaze filled with contempt. He had been the leader of the club, the one everyone looked up to, and he had wielded his influence like a weapon, turning others against her, feeding the fires of jealousy and resentment. Khang's heart twisted with horror as he watched the memories unfold, each one more painful than the last. He saw Ngoc standing alone on the stage, her face pale with fear as she confronted Bao, her voice trembling as she demanded answers, as she tried to understand why her friends had turned against her. But Bao's response was cold, merciless. He had humiliated her, ridiculed her in front of the others, stripping her of her dignity, her self-worth. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he had orchestrated her fall, spreading rumors, turning her once beloved stage into a place of torment. The final vision that filled Khang's mind was the most haunting of all. He saw Ngoc alone in the auditorium late one night, her face streaked with tears as she clutched her costume, the dress she had painstakingly crafted for the performance she would never give. She stood on the stage, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, her heart shattered by the betrayal that had robbed her of everything she had loved. And then, in one tragic, desperate act, she had taken her final bow. The memory was blurred, shrouded in shadows, but Khang felt the weight of her despair, as if it were his own, a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the auditorium, filling every corner, every seat, every inch of the stage. The vision faded, leaving Khang standing in the silence, his heart pounding, his mind reeling with the horror of what he had witnessed. Ngoc hadn't simply died, she had been driven to despair by those she had trusted, her dreams crushed, her spirit broken. And now her ghost lingered, bound to the place where her life had unraveled, a vengeful spirit driven by a need for justice that could not be quenched. Khang stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as he tried to shake off the weight of her sorrow, the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. He could feel her presence around him, her spirit entwined with the very essence of the auditorium, her soul woven into the fabric of the stage itself. "Ngoc," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and compassion. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." The air around him grew colder, and he felt a faint, ghostly touch on his shoulder, a presence that filled him with both comfort and sorrow. It was as if Ngoc were reaching out to him, a silent acknowledgement of his understanding, a fragile bond formed between them in the wake of her tragic tale. But there was no peace in her touch, no sense of closure. Her spirit was restless, her pain unhealed, her anger unquenched. She was bound to this place, her fate intertwined with the theatre hall, her vengeance simmering in the shadows, waiting to be unleashed upon those who had wronged her. Khang felt a shiver run through him as he realized the true nature of the curse. Ngoc's spirit was not merely seeking revenge, she was seeking justice, a retribution that had been denied to her in life. The auditorium was her courtroom, the stage her battlefield, and her tormentors her unwilling audience, condemned to face the consequences of their actions. As he stood there, the weight of her sorrow pressing down on him, Khang understood that he was now part of her story, a witness to the darkness that had consumed her life. He could feel her gaze upon him, a silent plea that cut through his heart, a plea for understanding, for justice, for release. But he was powerless to help her. Her spirit was bound by forces beyond his understanding, forces that tied her to this place, to the very stage that had witnessed her downfall. And as he looked around, he could feel the auditorium watching him, its walls bearing silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within its depths. Khang left the auditorium that night with a heavy heart, his mind filled with the sorrow and anger of a soul that had been wronged, a spirit condemned to linger in the shadows, waiting for a justice that had been long denied. But even as he walked away, he felt her presence linger, a shadow that clung to him, a reminder of the darkness that had taken root within the theatre hall. Ngoc's spirit was restless, her vengeance unfinished, and Khang knew with a chilling certainty that her story was far from over. The curse that bound her to the auditorium was still at work, weaving its threads into the lives of those who had betrayed her. And as he walked into the night, the memory of her sorrowful gaze filled his mind, a haunting reminder of the justice that would soon unfold. In the heart of the auditorium, in the shadows that clung to the stage, Ngoc's spirit waited, her eyes fixed on the world she had left behind, her heart filled with a bitterness that could not be silenced. Part 8. The Haunting Finale. The days that followed Khang's discovery were filled with a suffocating silence, an unnatural quiet that settled over the university campus like a dark fog. The shadow of Ngoc's tragic story hung heavy in the air, growing darker and more intense with each passing day. Khang could feel it, a building tension that clawed at his mind, wrapping around his heart with an icy grip. It was as if the very walls of the auditorium held their breath, waiting for the final act to play out. Khang tried to warn the remaining members of the theater club, but his words fell on deaf ears. Vivian's close friends, Bao's followers, and all who had once turned their backs on Ngoc continued to dismiss him, their arrogance blinding them to the creeping darkness that closed in around them. They laughed, brushed off his words, taunting him for being superstitious and weak, yet deep down, Khang could see the fear in their eyes, the way they glanced over their shoulders, as if sensing the invisible presence that now stalked their lives. Then the haunting began to intensify. One by one, Vivian's friends began to experience strange, terrifying occurrences. Flickering lights in empty hallways, whispers that drifted through the night, and shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, slithering along the walls and across the floors like dark, formless creatures. They each felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched, the creeping dread that lurked in every corner of the campus, especially near the theater building. But the worst of it came at night, in their rooms, where the shadows would deepen, pressing against them, as if the very darkness itself were alive, filled with a malevolent presence they couldn't escape. Vivian's friends, once bold and arrogant, began to unravel. Each of them carried their guilt in different ways, but they had all been complicit in Ngoc's suffering, and now that guilt festered within them, drawn out by the spirit's relentless presence. At first they tried to ignore it, to brush it off as paranoia, but the nightmares began, haunting them every time they closed their eyes. Khang could only watch, helpless and horrified, as they began to fall apart, one by one. He kept his distance, avoiding the theater hall where he knew Ngoc's spirit lingered, waiting for her final acts of vengeance to unfold. But even from afar he could feel her presence, an invisible thread that connected him to the dark events unfolding around him. One night, the first of Vivian's friends, Min, found himself alone in the dimly lit practice room. He had stayed late, hoping to finish his lines for an upcoming show, but the quiet of the empty building unnerved him. Shadows stretched across the room, dancing in the flickering light of the single bulb that swayed above him. Suddenly the light dimmed, casting the room into near darkness. A chill swept through the air, and Min felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there, only the shadows, creeping closer, pressing against him, filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. A whisper drifted through the silence, soft and haunting, filled with a sorrow that clawed at his mind. "Why did you betray me?" Min, the voice murmured, filled with a quiet fury that sent a shiver down his spine. "Why did you turn your back on me?" Min's heart pounded, his pulse racing as he backed away, his hands trembling as he stumbled against the wall. The shadows coiled around him, dark and suffocating, and in that moment he saw her, a ghostly figure, her face pale, her eyes hollow and filled with a sorrow that twisted his insides. "Ngoc," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and regret. But the figure only stared, her gaze piercing, unforgiving, as the darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. And then, in a single terrifying instant, the light shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The next morning, Min was found unconscious, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror as he muttered Ngoc's name over and over, his mind broken by the encounter. The doctor said he had suffered a severe mental breakdown, but Khang knew the truth. Ngoc's spirit had claimed him, her vengeance carving its way through his mind, leaving him a hollow shell. In the days that followed, more of Vivian's friends fell victim to the spirit's wrath. Hien, who had once been Ngoc's closest confidante before she turned against her, began to see visions of Ngoc in her dreams. Every night she would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, her mind filled with images of Ngoc's tear-streaked face, her sorrowful gaze haunting her even in the waking hours. One night, Hien found herself unable to sleep, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a vice. She wandered through the campus, her mind racing, desperate for escape. But as she passed by the darkened windows of the auditorium, she felt a sudden pull, an invisible force drawing her in, compelling her to step inside. The doors creaked as she entered, and the shadows swallowed her whole. She could feel Ngoc's presence, a heavy, suffocating force that pressed against her chest, filling her lungs with an icy chill. And then she heard it, the soft, sorrowful whisper that filled the silence, laced with a quiet fury. Hien, you left me to suffer. You turned your back on me. Hien tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat as the shadows closed in, filling her vision, suffocating her. In that moment she saw Ngoc's face, twisted with sorrow and anger, her hollow eyes piercing into her soul. And then, in a heartbeat, everything went dark. The following morning, Hien was found collapsed outside the auditorium, her face contorted in terror, her mind shattered. She too had fallen to Ngoc's vengeance, her guilt consuming her from the inside out. Vivian watched in horror as her friends were claimed, one, by the spirit's relentless wrath. The curse, which she had once dismissed as mere superstition, had now grown into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She tried to flee, to escape the darkness that had taken root in their lives, but no matter where she went, she felt Ngoc's presence, an invisible shadow that clung to her, a whisper that filled her mind with dread. One night, driven to the edge of her sanity, Vivian returned to the auditorium, desperate to confront the spirit, to beg for forgiveness, for mercy. She stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling as she called out, her voice echoing through the empty hall. Ngoc, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Her voice broke, her eyes filling with tears as she stood in the darkness, her heart pounding, her fear overwhelming. But the silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until a faint whisper filled the air, soft and chilling, filled with a quiet, simmering anger. Sorry, the voice murmured, echoing through the shadows. You were never sorry, Vivian. You watched as I suffered, and now you will feel my pain. In that moment, the lights in the auditorium flickered, casting the room into an eerie half-light, and Vivian saw her, the ghostly figure of Ngoc, standing at the edge of the stage, her face twisted with sorrow and fury. Her hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Vivian's knees buckled as she fell to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared at the spirit, her mind racing with terror. Please, Ngoc. I didn't mean for any of this. I was just jealous. But Ngoc's gaze remained unyielding, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through Vivian, laying bare every sin, every betrayal, every lie. She raised a pale, ghostly hand, pointing directly at her, her voice filled with a quiet, deadly finality. You took everything from me, Vivian, my friends, my dreams, my life. And now I would take everything from you. A gust of icy wind swept through the auditorium, and the lights flickered, casting Ngoc's figure into sharp relief. Vivian tried to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey, paralyzed by the spirit's unrelenting gaze. And then, in a single, horrific moment, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The final scream that tore from Vivian's lips echoed through the empty halls, a sound filled with a terror so profound it lingered in the silence long after she had fallen silent. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found her lifeless on the stage, her face frozen in an expression of pure horror, her eyes wide and empty, as if she had seen something beyond human comprehension in her final moments. Khang watched from a distance as the ambulance pulled away, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had witnessed. Ngoc's spirit had claimed her vengeance, exacting justice upon those who had wronged her, those who had watched her suffer and left her to die. He could feel her presence lingering, a quiet, sorrowful whisper that filled the silence, a spirit bound to the place where her life had been taken, her heart forever haunted by the memories of betrayal and pain. But as he turned to leave, he felt a faint touch on his shoulder, a warmth that seemed to lift the weight from his heart. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered a quiet farewell, a final, silent promise to remember her, to keep her memory alive. And as he walked away, the faint sound of her voice drifted through the air, a soft, haunting whisper that filled his mind with a sense of peace. Thank you, Khang. Part 9. Ngoc's farewell and the lingering mystery. The campus was unusually silent in the days that followed. as though the entire place was holding its breath. The once bustling theatre club had been left in shambles, its members either gone or too traumatized to continue. Whispers of hauntings of spirits and strange accidents filled the air, spreading through the university like a shroud of darkness. Students passed the auditorium in hurried steps, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting something unseen to emerge from the shadows. Everyone could feel it, that sense of something lingering, some mystery that had left an indelible mark on the building and all who had been a part of its history. Khang, however, couldn't stay away. He found himself drawn back to the auditorium one final time, a pull that was as comforting as it was haunting. He needed to return not out of fear but to see if there was any peace left in the place where so much tragedy had unfolded. As he stepped into the quiet hall, a faint glow seemed to flicker in the corners of the room, filling the darkness with a strange, gentle light. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket, yet he felt none of the terror that had accompanied him on his previous visits. Tonight there was only calm, a tranquility that he couldn't explain, as though the auditorium itself had finally been granted peace. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly against the empty seats, his gaze fixed on the stage where Ngoc had once poured her heart and soul into every performance. Her presence seemed to fill the room, lingering like a shadow. But it was different now, no longer filled with anger or sorrow, but with something quieter, more gentle. Khang felt a warmth settle over him, a quiet assurance that he was not alone, that the spirit he had come to know so well was still here, watching him with a quiet smile. And then he saw her. At the edge of the stage, bathed in a soft, ethereal light, stood Ngoc. Her figure was faint, almost transparent, but her face was serene, her eyes filled with a peace that he had never seen before. She wore the same green dress, the intricate embroidery glistening in the dim light, but there was no sorrow in her gaze, no bitterness or pain, only a calm acceptance, a sense of closure. Khang's heart swelled with emotion as he looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and sadness filling his chest. He took a tentative step forward, his voice barely more than a whisper, as he spoke her name. Ngoc, she smiled, a soft, gentle smile that seemed to illuminate the darkness around her. "Thank you, Khang," she murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that sent a shiver down his spine. "Thank you for listening, for seeing me." Even when everyone else turned away, Khang felt a tear slip down his cheek as he looked at her, his heart aching with a mixture of grief and relief. "I'm sorry, Ngoc," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything that happened to you, for all the pain you had to endure." She shook her head, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "It wasn't your fault, Khang. None of it was. You were the one person who tried to understand, who tried to listen. That was all I ever wanted." The weight of her words settled over him, filling him with a warmth that eased the ache in his chest. He had feared at first that he would never be able to help her, that her spirit would remain bound to the auditorium, trapped by the injustices she had suffered. But now, as he looked at her, he could see the peace in her eyes, the sense of closure that had finally allowed her to find rest. Ngoc's gaze softened as she looked at him, a quiet gratitude shining in her eyes. "I can move on now, Khang. Thanks to you, I'm free," he nodded, his voice barely more than a whisper as he choked out the words. I'm glad, Ngoc. I'm so glad you found peace." She reached out, her ghostly hand brushing against his cheek in a touch so gentle it felt like a whisper of wind. He closed his eyes, savoring the sensation, feeling her presence linger for a moment before she began to fade, her figure dissolving into the soft light that surrounded her. But before she disappeared completely, she looked at him one last time, her gaze filled with a quiet, haunting beauty. "Remember me, Khang," she whispered, her voice drifting through the silence like a ghostly melody. "Remember my story, and keep it alive." "That's all I ask," he nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words, his mind filled with the memory of her sorrow and her strength. "I will, Ngoc, I promise." With one final, gentle smile, she faded into the darkness, her figure dissolving into the shadows that clung to the stage. The warmth of her presence lingered for a moment, a soft, gentle glow that seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace, a tranquility that wrapped around him like a blanket. And then she was gone. Khang stood alone in the empty auditorium, the silence settling over him like a shroud. But it was no longer a place of terror or sorrow, it was a place of memory, a place that bore the weight of Ngoc's story, her life, her dreams, and her final, haunting farewell. He could feel her presence lingering in the shadows, not as a ghost, but as a memory, a reminder of the strength and resilience of a spirit that had refused to be forgotten. As he turned to leave, a soft, haunting melody drifted through the air, filling the silence with a song that seemed to echo through the empty halls, a melody that spoke of sorrow and love, of dreams lost and justice claimed. It was Ngoc's song, a final farewell that filled his heart with a mixture of grief and gratitude, a haunting reminder of a story that would never be forgotten. The auditorium would forever be marked by her memory, a place of mystery and sorrow, a place that bore the weight of her life and her death. Students would whisper of the girl in green, of the spirit that had once haunted the stage, and those who listened would feel a shiver of fear, a sense of awe as they remembered her story, her life, and the justice she had claimed. And as Khang walked away, he could still hear her song, a soft, haunting melody that filled his mind, a memory that would stay with him forever. Ngoc was gone, but her spirit, her story, her life would linger, forever entwined with the shadows of the auditorium, a haunting reminder of the tragedy and justice that had unfolded within its walls.